Okay, we have 32 people on the line, so let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. This is Penny Gross, the Potomac Watershed Roundtable, and also a member of the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our first meeting of Roundtable for 2021. I think if you're like me, you have missed these quarterly meetings and the opportunity to have good presentations and also a lot of camaraderie. I miss the personal interactions and I miss the lunches, but I quite frankly don't miss the drive to distant places on wintry mornings. But like everyone else, I think we've all mastered to a certain extent Zoom. And so I want to just give a couple of housekeeping mentions. They are also in the chat, as I understand. Please remain muted throughout the presentations. We are recording the program, and it will post to the Roundtable website. But please be sure to remain muted. And also, if you just mute your video or stop your video, also, because sometimes that we have too many people on video, it really slows down. You get those hesitations from the presenter, which isn't necessarily good. So when you want to speak, use the raise your hand feature, and Laura Grape will help me navigate that. We do have time at the end for announcements. So without further ado, I think we will go ahead and begin our agenda, which is had been sent to you earlier. Before I start with the agenda, does anybody have any question about how we're going to run this meeting today? We're all pretty adept at this, I think, now. Okay, our first item is updates from the chair, and like everyone else, all meetings about just about anything have been via Zoom or some other virtual platform. The Stakeholders Advisory Group that I serve on down in Richmond, Phase 3 RIPS, did have a couple of phone meetings, and mostly every other meeting, Chesapeake Bay Policy Committee at the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, Local Government Advisory Committee, to the Chesapeake Executive Council, everything, like you all, everything has been done by virtual platform. I think sometimes it helps focus, but sometimes it really miss the opportunity to truly share what our jurisdictions have been doing. I wanted to bring to your attention a gorgeous calendar that I just got yesterday. It's a calendar, it's protecting the natural beauty of the Chesapeake Bay. And the February has a photo of the Bay Bridge. But the neat thing about this, it was done by a number of partners, including Clean Fairfax, the Chesapeake Legal Alliance, the Alice Ferguson Foundation, the Anacostia Riverkeeper, Blue Oyster Environmental, Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences, Waterkeepers Chesapeake. Beautiful photograph with the page, the calendar page. But on the flip side, it talks about the problems and the solutions. So this is an educational piece also. And the February one, which was sort of sponsored by Clean Fairfax, talks about plastics in the environment and the problem that plastics have in our waterways. And so I'm going to share that with the website with Laura, and these calendars, as I understand, are available still for $10 each. And so if you teach, or if you have, any place that really has an opportunity for some conversation, not just pretty pictures, but conversation about various elements that are affecting our waterways, I highly recommend this one to you. I think it's a really cool calendar. In the metropolitan region, especially in Fairfax County, one of our issues about that affects our waterways is more frequent, more intense storms. Now, granted, we've not had one of those this fall and winter, but in the summertime, almost exactly 1 year apart, we had enormous flooding because of these very intense storms. Another item that is becoming more, it's becoming more, people are becoming more aware of it, is what's called sunny day flooding. And I don't recall that we've talked about sunny day flooding at Potomac Watershed Roundtable, but I know we've talked about it at LGAC. And that is, a lot of it affects the Tidewater area. But actually, it also has effects on places like the city of Alexandria, where you've got higher water levels, and now you're flooding areas that are normally used for housing and commercial activity. So that's one of the things I think we need to pay more attention to as we talk about sea level rise, because it's not just, places, more rural areas that may get flooding. It's some of our downtown areas are getting sunny day flooding. Andrea McClellan, who is a member of the Norfolk City Council, has been talking to the governor about doing some sort of a statewide flooding commission. Don't think it's getting a lot of traction right now because of other things, but it is something we need to pay attention to. It's not just Tidewater, it will affect some of our areas within the Watershed Roundtable area. And let's see, I think that really is the extent of any updates that I wanted to put out there. I'm going to turn to updates from the Potomac Council Chair, John Peterson. Your council met this morning for the first time since last year, since last January. And so would you please give us any updates from the council? Thanks.
I certainly will, Chairman Penny. Thanks, and welcome everybody. We did meet this morning for the first time since last January. It was good to see everybody again, although I think all of us, including those of us on the roundtable itself, would like to get back together in person as quickly as we can. But we did have a number of things we discussed this morning. I will be brief. We discussed not only our council officers, but the roundtable officers. The bylaws for the roundtable call for a chairman, that's Penny, and a vice chairman, two vice chairmen really. One is Woody Hansen from the Northern Neck, and the other had been Marty Noe from Prince William, and Marty has dropped out, I think, a year or two back. So one of the things that the council authorized us to do this morning, Chairman Penny, is work with you and Woody and see about coming up with maybe that second other vice president. And then we also took a look at the actual member appointments for the roundtable itself. There are some member appointments that we've never really been able to fill, but maybe there are some others that we should have that we haven't looked at and should be on the roundtable that we should invite. So again, working with Penny and with Woody, Laura and I will, and the others too, will work with you and see if there are some new categories of people that probably should be on the roundtable that we didn't have. The other thing we talked about was upcoming roundtable meetings and some suggestions for possible programs. Two things came up this morning. One came up from John Flannery in Loudoun County, but it affects the other counties, I'm sure. And that's this idea of tipping, where people will come out with a truckload of garbage and pay some farmer to dump it on their land, and all of a sudden that farm has become a trash heap. That's apparently getting to be more of a problem than many of us realize. So one of the sessions we might want to talk about just what is happening in the various counties and see how big a problem that is. And it's probably illegal anyway. So we probably could look at that as a topic. And another topic was soil health. And we've got some suggestions for some speakers on soil health. So we had a really good council meeting. We're going to get back together, and Penny will be back in touch with you and Woody and see about dealing with some of those issues.
Thank you, John. Soil health is a fascinating topic. At the COG, Chesapeake Bay Policy Committee, it's been probably over a year ago, because I remember we were meeting in person. We had, I think, a professor from somewhere in Maryland who brought samples, actually, of different soils and did little exercises with them to explain to us what was a good soil and what wasn't a good soil. It was really a fascinating presentation. So I think soil health would be a very good one, especially now as we're looking more at, as Fairfax County is looking at composting food scraps, and we have a collection station at both of our transfer stations, but we're looking at maybe expanding that to regular households, and a number of folks want to do composting, not just leaves, but the kitchen scraps, which then also goes into your sort of backyard soil health. So I like that idea very much.
Chairman Penny, that we do have some good speakers, we think, for that. The other thing I forgot to mention, and you might want to ask Laura about the financial situation for the roundtable, which is healthy. Okay,
thank you. And Laura, as soon as I finish my next comment, if you would weigh in. The tipping issue that John raised for you is an unusual one, not that I had heard of. I mean, we have dumping that's illegal that, VDOT has to take care of quite often. But that the idea that somebody is paying to dispose of their trash on somebody else's land sounds to me like it's a violation of many, many, many things. And so that may be something we want to investigate a little bit further. That just makes me shudder. As far as member appointments, I'm wondering, because we've all been so focused on health these days for the past year, if there might be a spot for a healthcare provider of some sort to be a member of the roundtable. Maybe that's one of those areas we want to add. John, you and I can talk about that, but there is a direct connection between the environment and health. And we're seeing over this last year, almost, that people are wanting to connect more with the environment now, since they can't connect with one another. And so we might want to look at that opportunity. Laura, I'm going to ask Laura to tell us about the financial condition of the roundtable, but also give people an opportunity, if you've got an idea for other industries or segments of the community to be considered for membership on the roundtable, please put them in the chat. We're not looking for names, we're looking for areas of expertise or areas of the community that may not have already been identified. Laura? Are you there, Laura?
Yes, I apologize. The one thing about working from home is that oftentimes the doorbell rings and you have to go and answer it right in the middle of a meeting. So I apologize. I was listening. I just wanted to let you know we did submit a grant to DEQ for continued support of the roundtable in calendar year 2021. All right, I'm back. I apologize. Let me catch my breath here for a second. We are, as John was mentioning, we are in good financial shape. We had just modest expenses this last year with being able to maintain the functionality of the council and the roundtable, making sure that we had our website reestablishing and the resubscription for our domain name as well as our web hosting software. So we're good to go for another 2 years. And again, we are in good financial state, thanks in part, as Debbie was mentioning earlier today, some of the past work over the last 20 years with the roundtable in terms of creating a nice reserve. So we are absolutely able to continue this year. We do have, as I mentioned, a grant proposal in with DEQ. Very much appreciate their continued support of the roundtable and roundtables across the Commonwealth. And we should hear back shortly. There's always a little bit of discussion that takes place with any of these proposals, but we can feel confident being able to move forward and continuing this year.
Thank you, Laura. The fact that we did not have our regular meetings, does that mean that perhaps we will see a reduction in funding because we didn't spend as much as we might have, or is it pretty much level funding?
It's pretty level in terms of what we requested this year. It's pretty level. Some additional work with reaching out on WIP 3 issues as well to a number of the smaller MS4 communities and across our area. But we will have, we are requesting pretty level funding. Virtual is very different than a meeting in person. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of logistics that go into it. But nonetheless, there's still a continuation of much of the administration of the program and of course the logistics in terms of just setting up the agendas for our meetings. So
you think they're okay now?
Again, I feel comfortable with where we are at.
Thank you. Thank you. As long as we don't get penalized for something that was completely outside of our control. All right. Moving on, we've got a couple of minutes. Does anybody have anything they wanted to add to this conversation? I see some of our regulars. I see Daniel Moore, go Ducks, and Kirsten Conrad, I see you there. And I know that Curtis Dalpro from ICPRB is on, and at some point, Curtis, I'd like to chat with you a little bit as to whether ICPRB is seeing anything in the way of the sunny day flooding that I had just mentioned, but we can talk about that offline. So does anybody want to add anything, have anything burning that you want to say right now before we move on?
Penny, this is Laura. I just wanted to note that Woody Henson is also on. I just called him out. Hi, Woody. He's listed under Norm Rizvi, so that if you're looking for his particular name, it's not popping up, but he is on as well. So I just wanted to acknowledge that our vice chair is here.
Thank you. I see Woody, but I saw that Norm Rizvi, and I'm thinking, I don't know this person, and it was just, Woody, thank you for being on. It's good to see you.
Chairman Penny, this is John Peterson again. I might mention that the vice chairman of the council is now Robert Pickett from the Northern Neck Soil and Water Conservation District. He's the chairman of that district.
Thank you. Thank you. And Marty Noe rotated off because he is no longer an elected official, so he doesn't represent Prince William anymore. All right, we are going to move on.
Penny?
Yes.
This is Curtis, and
Yes, Curtis.
you have my information, and I'd be happy to chat with you at any time.
Thank you.
I guess the one sad announcement I would make is first 2021 casualty of COVID is the Potomac River Swim for the Environment, which was again canceled for this year, and that goes. That's a charity swim for the environment that goes from Whole Neck, Virginia, and the swimmers go from there over to Point Lookout and swim the whole width of the river there, which is about 5 miles. And I'm just, it's very sad these things get postponed, and I hope that not too many of them get postponed to the point where these things never come back. So just making that sad announcement today.
Thank you, Curtis. What time of the year is that swim usually done?
That's usually done toward the end of May.
Oh, okay. At least it's warmer weather.
Well, and the thing with the swim is it requires close contact, and then they started looking at, did they want to require vaccinations and stuff, and it just got to be too complicated for a volunteer group to be able to pull off.
Of course. And a lot of volunteer groups have found that whatever their normal social fundraising has been completely canceled through this past year. And there are many nonprofits and volunteer organizations who are really, really hurting. And yes, we hope that those activities will come back when you have herd immunity or whatever the terminology is, because humans are social animals. We need each other. We need to be able to be together. It's nice to see everybody on the screen, but it isn't the same at all as having those personal contacts and, the individual smiles and the eyebrow raises and the whispers and all of that. And so we need to get back to our normal routines, but we need to do it safely. So thank you, Curtis. We are going to move ahead now and get we're way ahead of schedule, aren't we? Is our presenter Justin Williams on the line already?
Yes, he is. I saw him just a little bit ago on here. Justin, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, very good. Then thank you. If you don't mind, we will go ahead and we'll get a little ahead of ourselves, but we'll save time at the end for group discussion. So this is an update on the WIP Phase 3 goals in the time of COVID-19. And Justin Williams is the director of the Office of Watershed and Local Government Assistance Programs with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. He has his office includes DEQ's watershed programs such as TMDL development, implementation plans, and implementation plan projects funding, as well as the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act program. He started in this role at DEQ just weeks before the COVID shutdown, so he's fairly new to us. And he has a BS in environmental health from East Tennessee State University and a JD, summa cum laude, from the Appalachian School of Law. Mr. Williams, we're delighted to welcome you. Please tell us what you think we should know.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to talk today. I know, unfortunately, in the world today, we're having to do this meeting virtually, so unfortunately, I don't get to meet a lot of you folks in person, as would be ideal, especially as I've taken over this position in February of 2020. So I began the position, and then immediately the world has gone virtual. So I've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of folks, but not meet. Hopefully that will change over the coming year. So today I wanted to kind of talk about update on the WIP goals and the wake of COVID-19 and really talk about some of the other things that we're working on as well throughout the watershed programs, focusing on improvement to water quality and particularly in the Bay area as well. So hopefully everyone can see the PowerPoint that I'm presenting. Laura, you'll let me know if you don't or if there's any technical challenges. It's always a continuing process to work through, even though we've been virtual for a while now. So I wanted to start off just in terms of some of the things that I'll be highlighting and hitting on, and hopefully look forward to any questions or discussions as well from folks. I'll be the first to admit that certainly my office, which is the Watersheds and Local Government Assistance, has heavy involvement, particularly related to water quality, including in the Bay, as well as the work that we do under the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act. As many of you know, I am not the direct WIP guru for DEQ. That, of course, is James Martin, who has worked tirelessly for years with various folks, including yourselves, on the work that we are doing in the Bay. But put some information and highlights for everybody. Of course, as many folks probably know or see in the news today, the impact of COVID in Virginia, as strong and significant as it's been nationally and throughout the world. Talk a little bit about some of the WIP 3 highlights and the current milestones, the report that we just finalized last month, actually, on the 2020-2021 milestones and some of the impact that COVID's had. And as you would see reflected in that reporting, some of the work we're doing with TMDL priorities and implementation plan efforts in the watersheds program, including connection to the Bay TMDL and projects there. The CBPA regulatory amendments, which is a big piece of what the CBPA program is working on now that many of you have probably heard about. Some of our initial work kicking off exploring a Chesapeake Bay no discharge zone, some updates and information on grants, and then of course look forward to any questions or discussion. So this is probably not new information for a lot of folks. Unfortunately, this is the statistics that we're currently facing in Virginia. Under the COVID pandemic, Virginia has seen approximately 515,000 cases and over 21,000 hospitalizations, and unfortunately, several thousand that we have lost in this pandemic. On the bright side, it does start to look like it's getting better with the rollout of the vaccinations. Virginia has moved ahead with approximately 895,000 vaccines that have been administered, according to the Virginia Department of Health. And there's actually now a rollout of approximately 40,000 vaccines each day in Virginia. So hopefully as this rollout continues, we can all not only start to see a shift in the tragedy of this pandemic, but also a return to normalcy. Obviously, a lot of the work that we're doing in terms of the day-to-day, not just in governmental work, but in workplace work, is being driven by Virginia guidelines. The governor obviously issued Executive Order 72 outlining the guidelines and restrictions for Virginia that continue into place now. And as many of you are aware as well, Virginia kind of led the way in a lot of ways with their workplace regulations and guidelines, and that includes the work both that Dolly has done and now at the federal level. There has been final Dolly guidelines on the infectious disease prevention of SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19, that dictates a lot of the restrictions and requirements, of course, for the workplace. And that's really driving a lot of the ability to impact some of the day-to-day work, not only from obviously having to transition to virtual meetings as we're doing today, but just the ability for staff and folks such as yourself to be able to carry out some of the work and talk about some of that when we look at the COVID impacts as identified in the WIP 3 milestones. Obviously, a big unknown that continues in all of this that there's already been identified is the fiscal impacts, not only from a societal or economic standpoint with the rate of unemployment and unemployment claims, but also, of course, the resulting impact on budgets and funding, which, of course, a lot of the focus for the work that we do related to the Bay and implementation of the WIP is the result of state and federal funding. I can say, though, that to my knowledge and the work that we've seen so far, we're not seeing a direct reduction or impact so much on the state budget level. Obviously, that will or could change as the General Assembly moves through the session and or the final fiscal impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic are identified. Certainly, this governor and administration remains committed to Bay protection and the work that's being done there, and we're very thankful of that. We've been fortunate so far to not have seen a significant fiscal impact. Certainly, though, the impact has come more directly with the ability to hire and staffing as budget forecast and budget work continues, and some of the work that we go through to be able to backfill, particularly when we have a vacancy or bring on new staff. At the federal levels, similarly, as many of you know, the actual federal funding in the Bay Area for pass-through for local governments has actually increased over several years, and we have not heard again, similarly, from the federal level, a direct indication of a reduction or an impact. Mostly we've seen any impact in recent years more to the core program, which of course does affect our ability to hire staffing, but we are fortunate that we have continued to see increase in pass-through funding at the federal level, and I think similarly, a lot will remain unknown until the final fiscal impacts of the pandemic are identified and the resulting impact on the budget. But as of now, we haven't been asked or identified specific cuts at the federal level as well. Obviously, the biggest day-to-day impact, aside from day-to-day lives, is the work that we're able to do given the restrictions and the necessity for distancing and so forth, and our ability to actually meet and carry out some of the work that we need to do, especially with engaging stakeholders. I think we've now, hopefully most of us, including DEQ, have worked into the world of being able to manage virtual meetings to get some of this work continued on and implemented, and we'll talk about some of the impacts again that that's had directly as identified in the WIP milestones. And of course, as I mentioned, the impact itself on staffing, while we haven't seen those direct cuts yet, there's certainly been a pause in terms of being able to backfill somewhat as the actual budget implications remain somewhat unknown. So I'm sure most, if not all of you, are familiar, of course, with Virginia's WIP 3 that was developed in 2019, which was the overall plan to achieve nutrient sediment reductions needed to restore the Chesapeake Bay and its tidal tributaries. This, of course, is available if you haven't or aren't familiar with the WIP 3 on our website. You can go in and look at the plan that was submitted by Virginia to EPA. One of the important things I wanted to note is that this WIP 3 did incorporate elements of climate change and adaptation into the actual work and the projects. And one particular note that I thought was interesting that you all may be familiar with if you've worked with the WIP or seen the WIP is that the Chesapeake Bay program modeling estimates an additional 9 million pounds of nitrogen and 0.5 million pounds of phosphorus reductions are needed to offset the effects of climate change by 2025. So we're not just seeing the necessary reductions needed to help improve the Chesapeake Bay, but also those reductions that are the direct effect of climate change. And of course, identified in the WIP, Virginia's share of that additional load reduction is 1.722 million pounds of nitrogen and 0.193 million pounds of phosphorus. As identified in the WIP, Virginia committed to have all practices and controls in place by 2025 to achieve the final phase 3 WIP nutrient and sediment planning targets in accordance with the timelines and goals that were previously developed by the Bay Program Partnership and included in the 2014 Watershed Agreement. I wanted to highlight too, of course, an important part of the WIP and the work that we do to improve the Bay comes through our local government engagement. These were some of the measures and activities identified in the WIP related to that based on the feedback that we received from hundreds of folks, particularly in the urban and developed sector. Those included things such as increasing DEQ's SLAF funding, expanded use of the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program, more urban nutrient management planning, enhanced promotion of living shorelines, expanded septic pump out and other maintenance program activities, and improved coordination of local reporting. And of course, another big element of the WIP and the work that's being done is in the agricultural sector, and the engagement and activities identified there were creation of additional incentives for a variety of buffer widths and lifespans, new incentives for extended BMP lifespans, and equine work group to address the implementation of BMPs on equine operations, including horse pasture management, remove or increase annual participation caps for cost share, bundling BMTs into a single cost share contract, increase maximum tax credits, modified practice specifications for cover crops, animal waste, stream protection, forest buffers, and nutrient management, and of course move towards regional agricultural B&P priorities. And so these are the major elements based on the feedback that was received to be identified. And then, of course, into specific activities under the WIP 3 based on that feedback related to the engagement at the local government level. If you haven't had an opportunity, we did finalize the 2020-2021 milestones, which is our reporting on where we are based on those specific activities under the WIP, and that is also available on our website. So I encourage you to go and take a look at that, and you can see an update on each one of the items. Just wanted to hit some of the highlights from that. Livestock stream exclusions were expanded. There was approximately 350 septic B&Ps installed in the Bay Area using $1.4 million in funding. As of December 31st, 2020, 93% of Phase 2 MS4 action plans have been reviewed. There's progress on the My Tree Counts application, which is the tree mapping application that was identified for folks to increase tree planting. We continue to upgrade and work on the B&P warehouse system. I know that's an important and big focus of folks, is being able to make sure that that warehouse system is operable and enhanced to be able to report and incorporate those B&Ps that are being done. Conserve Virginia was updated with a water quality improvement opportunity areas layer. And of course, as many of you know, Virginia did release and the work that Admiral Phillips is doing on the Virginia Coastal Master Plan. One of the important things I also wanted to note related to the COVID impacts, and again, you may have noticed if you looked at the milestones, but although the milestones were reported last month to EPA in terms of an update, they're actually going to be revisited in the fall, and I apologize, it should be fall 2021 when the report was submitted last month to update based on these impacts. And specifically, when you look at some of the milestones, there was reporting highlighted due to delay, where we had delays due to COVID impacts. That included, for example, implementation and some of the outreach work with the Healthy Virginia Laws program, working on the marketing and the SLAF solicitation work, looking at stakeholder advisory groups for nutrient management planning under the ENS regulations, and for reevaluating post-construction water quality design criteria requirements. And also another thing, and I'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into grants, is that there was an extension on the CBIG grants as well, as PDCs were implementing those elements related to septic pump outs and ag assessments. And of course, throughout the milestone reporting is a recognition of the impact due to staffing and resources from COVID impacting not only the ability to have meetings or do outreach, but of course, being able to backfill or fill certain positions in light of budget uncertainties. So that's wanted to hit some of the highlights on the WIP and the milestone, and then talk a little bit more about some of the specific work, particularly in my shop and some of the other work as well related to funding going on that's identified to not only impact or hopefully improve the work that's being done in the Bay, but also identified under the WIP as well. As many of you may know, if you saw the public notice back in the spring last year, we are working on updating our TMDL priorities for the 2022-2028 cycle, and we'll be identifying specific targets for that cycle. And based on some feedback and potential direction from EPA, we'll also be looking at some general priorities beyond that 2028 timeframe as well. And there'll be an opportunity as we move forward to finalize that list, in addition to the initial public engagement that we conducted to public notice that list and provide folks an opportunity to provide us feedback. Another thing that we've looked at and we're trying to do as we move forward with implementations plans is to incorporate the Bay TMDL IP projects into implementation plans as we finalize those. The goal there is to be able to identify, in addition to any other implementation projects that are identified as necessary in those implementation plans, to incorporate those so that that would also then provide an opportunity for those to be addressed more specifically through an opportunity under the 319 funding, which is the funding, of course, that comes from EPA to actually implement projects based on a request for proposal and issuance of contracts to address projects under those implementation plans. We recently have finalized the next round of 319 funding. We had 7 projects that were awarded with $1.9 million funding that will be going out for those projects. Another big item that we're working on that was actually also identified in the WIP as well, in part related to climate change, is the CBPA regulatory amendments, and many of you all have probably heard about these regulatory amendments as well. This is in part being driven in large part by the General Assembly's 2020 change to the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act, adding criteria for local government programs to encourage and promote coastal resiliency and adaptation to sea level rise and climate change, as well as to include criteria to encourage and promote preservation of mature trees, planting of trees as a water quality protection means, and providing other natural resource benefits. Those proposed regulatory amendments have been authorized by the State Water Control Board for public comment, and we are actually in the public comment period now. So if you do have an interest in those or any comments or feedback, now's the time to submit that until May 3rd. And then we will actually be holding a stakeholder advisory group meeting in May, following up on the State Water Control Board's action when they authorize these for public comment, to have DEQ host a stakeholder advisory group meeting to bring folks together and talk about the proposal and the regulations prior to taking it back to the State Water Control Board, which will likely happen in June. Another element of this is even prior to this legislative change, as we received grant funding to be able to engage BIMS and William & Mary Coastal Policy Center to provide assistance, focusing on guidance, development, and technical assistance. Part of that effort that's already begun and underway is work that BIMS has begun doing related to GIS technical work, and really looking at the forecasting of water features in the future and buffers, and then being able to use that information to do some analysis in terms of water quality impacts and opportunities or options for measures to address that when you're looking at the forecast related to those features and areas. On the climate adaptation side, which was a specific item, as I mentioned, recognized under the WIP to be incorporated as we move forward with that work, that regulatory amendment, as it outlines now under the proposed amendment, is creating a new subsection under the CVPA regs, providing for a 3-year time frame for incorporation by the localities. Specifically, of course, in recognizing climate adaptation measures as an allowed activities, specifically within the resource protection areas, incorporating consideration of climate change impacts in the local site plan reviews, and requiring the use of models or forecasts in a 30-year time frame to look at those impacts when considering potential development in the resource protection area. Does include other elements, including providing for limitations on exceptions granting, the criteria specifically for climate adaptation measures, aside from distinguishing between undeveloped and developed lands, incorporating other criteria such as BMPs recognized at the state and federal level, and of course incorporation or preservation of natural features or vegetation. We did propose in the current proposed regulatory amendments a reduction for the WQIA requirement, where you have a non-point source BMP that can serve both the purpose of water quality protection and climate adaptation measure, and reducing the requirements for living shorelines, again consistent with the Commonwealth's policy and as identified in the WIP for promoting living shorelines and climate adaptation measures. The other regulatory amendment that's underway related to this, based on the General Assembly's actions, is the amendment to incorporate the recognition of mature trees and planting of trees within the CVPA regs. And that regulatory amendment, as proposed, specifically recognizes mature trees within the existing framework for those regs as it relates to preservation or establishment of vegetation, and focuses in on the general performance criteria that applies to CVPA areas And then, of course, the criteria specifically for resource protection areas as it relates to, again, the protection of mature trees or the requirement for planting of trees, and you have to manage or address vegetation under those criteria requirements. One of the other efforts that we've kicked off as well that was identified under the WIP is an evaluation and looking at a Chesapeake Bay no discharge zone. And really, this is an initial effort as we consider options for an NDZ for all or portions of the Chesapeake Bay main stem and its tributaries. And of course, this work will be, as we move forward, done in consultation with stakeholders. Currently, we're working right now in this initial effort as we've identified the objectives under this initial phase for exploring the Chesapeake Bay no discharge zone is to identify stakeholder concerns as well as areas of support, roadblocks or challenges, of course, that should be considered, looking at the adequacy of vessel sewage pump outs, and of course, the cost of vessel owners to comply with the NDZ, which is all part of the evaluation or package that would be required for submission to EPA in the pursuit of a no discharge zone, of which the Commonwealth has identified a few already. And then these tasks that we specifically are beginning to undertake as we look at this effort is data collection and targeted stakeholder outreach. We actually also have contracted support under this effort through CCRM and the William and Mary Coastal Policy Center to provide support for us as well as we move forward with evaluating this Chesapeake Bay no discharge zone. Obviously, always an important element, not only in the ability to do the work that we do in the Bay, but certainly for those folks working at the local level through local governments and PDCs is funding opportunities, specifically in the area of grants. The two that I wanted to speak about was the CBRAP grant and the CBIG grant. We are underway with our 2021 contracts for the CBRAP grants, with the 15 PDCs, each identifying an award of $58,000 each, and a $14,500 match. We have finalized the next scopes of services and contracts related to those, and this next effort is really designed to shift from planning to implementation, and those scopes focus on regionally specific implementation tasks. Of course, another important element in terms of BMPs and activities is the CBIG grant. We were, over the past cycle, identified $90,000 in CBIG grant funding. We're able to complete in the past year 164 pump outs through that grant program to PDCs and 39 agricultural assessments. We will be doing another RFP in short order to deal with the next cycle of funding that will be available under the CBIG. In addition to continuing to focus on ag and septic work, we want to continue to increase the opportunity for that funding to be used to look at programmatic elements of actually implementation under the CBIG program for the localities and the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act. Some of the work that we've done already in that area is we did finalize a contract with George Washington Regional Commission for form development. So they're going to be providing assistance by helping in the development of W2IA forms, and then also some grant funding identified for Ashland and their GIS mapping effort, which will then be able to be utilized and identified in a training opportunity to allow other localities to look at that GIS work and effort that was done and provide a training on utilizing GIS in their mapping efforts. And so that's really the highlights that I wanted to hit on. I certainly want to open it up for questions or any discussion on those items, and anything else that I can hopefully either provide some answers to or more importantly hear from you all on any thoughts, comments, or concerns as we move forward with the continued work under the WIP or the Bay work that we're doing in general in the EQ.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. That was a lot of material to present, and so we thank you very much. Before I go to questions from the roundtable, I have a couple that I wanted to mention. One is from your presentation. Am I to understand that, I think I know the answer to this question, but let me ask it anyway, that the 2025 deadline for phase 3 WIPs has not been advanced to account for COVID delays. Is that right? We're still under the
Correct.
same.
So there hasn't been a specific revision yet. Now, that isn't to say I think certainly, and that's again part of the effort as well when we do the revisiting of the milestones, for example, to explore that opportunity. You know, I think certainly we're aware and EPA is aware of the challenges that folks have had over the last year. I think the goal is to push forward the best we can, but in terms of an actual extension on that element, that hasn't come into play yet. But certainly, as we look at that more and get feedback, be part of the discussion, including discussion with you.
Okay, thank you. Also, on the Stormwater Local Assistance Fund, there is a bill in the General Assembly right now. It's Senate Bill 1309, introduced by Senator Adam Evan, which would expand the uses for local stormwater funds for SLAF. It passed the Senate unanimously and is now awaiting a hearing in House, County, Cities, and Towns Committee. It would allow SLAF funds to be used for comprehensive flood mitigation, including floodproofing, flood protection, and grading, rather than just the construction, improvement, or repair of a stormwater management facility, et cetera. Is this? It certainly expands the opportunities, but it doesn't really expand the amount of money in the fund, I don't think. Has DEQ, well, I'm sure DEQ is aware of this one. Could you comment on that?
So we are certainly aware. I couldn't really comment just in terms of when it comes to legislation. That work is done through, of course, coordination with the administration and the Secretary's office and our policy division. So we don't really take a position, or I couldn't speak to a thought on that particular legislation. But certainly if there's thoughts or feedback that folks have, happy to take that and share that back with our policy specialist.
Thank you. The reason I raised this issue is that Roundtable members may recall that every year, it seems, SLAF funding gets put on the chopping block in Richmond. Usually we are able to rescue it. We've been certainly advocating for more to be in the funding. You know, we need to make the pie bigger rather than making the slices smaller. So I raise this as one to keep an eye on, because if we may have similar situations that we've had in the past, that SLAF gets put on a chopping block. So that's why I wanted to raise it. And then the last thing I wanted to mention before we go to Q&A for you is the most recent, the latest edition of the Bay Journal had some very interesting and disturbing information about eelgrass disappearing in the Chesapeake. I think it's mostly in the Maryland areas, although the map that I saw showed that it's significant reductions all through the Bay. Has your division been doing any monitoring of that, or have any recommendations on that? Eelgrass was, of course, is very important for crabs and so forth, but it was coming back gangbusters, and now suddenly it's disappearing, apparently due to increased water temperatures. And this may not be right in your bailiwick, Mr. Williams, but I'm just raising it as something that was just in the Bay Journal.
Yeah, no, appreciate that. You know, as you know, certainly we work with localities, for example, through the CBVA program in terms of the on-the-ground work that they're looking at with as it relates to vegetation. You know, I couldn't speak to us being involved or you know, connected with this evaluation that you mentioned in the Bay Journal, but certainly we'll check that out and share that with some folks, particularly some of the technical folks that we work with as it relates to vegetation and some of those efforts.
Thank you. You know, having worked on bay issues for well over 20 years now, I'm excited about the progress that we have made that I wasn't sure we would see in my lifetime, but then we have these situations where we slide back, and it's frustrating, very frustrating. But it's also, you know, we have to be able to explain to our constituents why it's a good thing to do to move forward, even though they may say, well, look, all the work that you've done hasn't helped. Yes, it has, but it is an ongoing challenge. I know we have a question in the chat that I'm going to start with. This is from Will Lintner. What is the state of the Potomac watershed with regard to contributing to the overall pollution levels that we are trying to reduce for the Chesapeake Bay? What are our targets for nitrogen, phosphate, and sediment? And this may be a question that Mr. Williams could answer, or maybe another member of the roundtable could answer. So if I'll give you an opportunity, Mr. Williams. Do you have that kind of detail?
I don't have that kind of detail immediately available. Certainly, I could check on that, but as you know, maybe, of course, some of the folks who work directly within the watershed and the WIP may have those numbers more readily on the tip of their tongues than I have.
Thank you. I think maybe one of those people might be Norm Goulet, who I believe is on the line. Norm, I don't want to blindside you with this particular question. You may have to get back to us, but do you have any detail on that?
Good morning, Supervisor Gross. That information is currently not available. The progress numbers are being submitted to the Chesapeake Bay program right now, and it will still be a couple of months before the latest information is available. If you're looking for the older progress information, you can get that off the Chesapeake Bay program's website.
Thank you. So maybe we can have, Laura, hang on to that question, so we might be able to update it at our next Watershed Roundtable meeting. Let's go to Q&A regarding Mr. Williams' presentation from anybody who's on the call. You can use the chat feature or just seek recognition verbally if you'd like. Come on, folks. There was a lot of information in this presentation. I'm sure that there are some questions or comments.
Penny, if you don't mind, this is Laura Grape.
Yes, Laura, go ahead.
I just wanted to make a couple of notes and share that we did include a link to the Town Hall, Virginia Town Hall website, where there is the opportunity to provide public comment on the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act amendments that was related to the coastal resilience and sea level rise adaptations that Mr. Williams shared. So that link is in the chat for you. We also were able to click on the draw and was able to find the Bay Journal article that Ms. Gross referenced in regards to the depletion of the, so in your chat box as well. So just wanted to make a couple of quick notes related to that as well. I think the question that I had actually, Penny, you asked already in regards to what the what, if any, adjustments to the deadlines might we expect at this time, but it sounds as though there may be more information coming out later this year. And Mr. Williams, perhaps we can invite you back to a future meeting in order to share some of those updates as well as they become available. It may even be a year from now, but I think it would be wonderful to keep in communication regarding that. So anyway, just not real questions, but just statements and inquiries. So thank you.
No, appreciate that, and certainly happy to speak today and happy to come back anytime. I know we're fortunate to Daniel Moore, who sits in on your roundtable as well, who works in our CDPA program with me, is also always available, and appreciate the opportunity that we get to participate in your roundtable.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Mr. Williams. And certainly Daniel Moore has been a remarkable resource for the roundtable. He has been at our meetings consistently for several years. It's been very, very helpful. So thank you. Are there questions or comments?
I have a question.
Yes, who is that? Please identify yourself.
This is Curtis Salbra.
I thought that was you, Curtis. Go ahead.
I'm wondering if he could go into a little more detail on his slide on the 2021 milestones. He mentioned a water quality improvement layer that would include land preservation. Could you speak to that in a little more detail, what that is? Mr. Williams?
Yeah, so I can, and I will say though that's not a element that was is identified under the work that DEQ is doing, but I can certainly provide what I know, and then also, as I mentioned, both the WIP and the milestones information is available on our website. So I will pull up that specific information. So this work was being done with DCR as the lead, working with BDH, Department of Historic Resources, and others. And it's the Conserve Virginia model. And they updated it with a water quality improvement opportunity area, and that layer identifies 790,112 acres of highest priority lands for conservation in the interest of water quality improvement in general. And it was based off using estimates of nitrogen, phosphorus, and other loadings from agricultural sources from the CBPA Phase 6 watershed model and the Virginia Water Quality Assessment, with a focus on the goals of the Phase 3 WIP. And that information, again, the work there under that WIP initiative is being led by DCR.
Okay, thanks. It's interesting because Potomac River Commission is working on a land prioritization tool that we are going to eventually roll out this year sometime. And basically what it is a layer that would show land areas that would be particularly good to conserve in the realm of drinking water quality. So that sounds related, and maybe I'm pretty sure there's people at DEQ who are aware of this, but this is an upcoming tool that we really hope will help people prioritize conservation lands based on their importance to preserving drinking water quality. So thanks.
Thank you, Curtis. We have another question in the chat from John Bateman. Is DEQ closely following the transfer of septic pump out authority from local governments to the Virginia Department of Health in the 3 regions? Has there been any discussion about the expansion of septic pump out funding? And this may be something that we actually talk a little bit more with our next presenter, but Mr. Williams, you heard the question, I believe. Would you be able to comment?
So we are aware of those efforts. We have worked with BDH as they've explored that, and the work groups engaging stakeholders under their requirement from the General Assembly to evaluate that transfer, and that report being finalized. I think certainly in terms of funding, we continue to look for opportunities under our various grant fundings to promote, as we do with the CVIC for the septic pump outs. In terms of the actual funding for transition, that would be an element between BDH, obviously, and the stakeholders and General Assembly and their discussions based on the chat from that.
Thank you.
Share a link in the chat back to the previous question. This is the link to the DCR page with the Conserve Virginia that I was referencing for previously about the land layers as well.
Right now, I'd be a little concerned about giving the Virginia Partner Health any more anything else to do as they are working so much on COVID. But I recognize that they have different levels of folks working on different things. Let's go back to any other questions. Of course, you can put it in the chat or just ask for recognition verbally. Please go ahead, anyone?
If this is Laura again, just another note of logistics. If you're looking for the chat feature, it is in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You will see two words and icons, one saying participants and the other saying chat. So you just need to click on the chat in order for that box to appear.
Thank you, Laura. And there's lots of information with lots of websites listed in the chat from our members. So that's been very well used. Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Williams? Any comments at all? And Laura, I believe the slides will be available through the Roundtable's website. We do have a question. Actually, we have two more questions. One is a sort of how do I preserve the chat when the meeting ends? And that's a good question. How do you preserve the chat when the meeting ends? What happens to the chat? I've never quite understood that one, Laura.
That's a great question. I'm going to make sure that I capture and copy the chat, and we will include that on our website as well. So all of these wonderful links, you can actually copy and paste them if you want to hold on to them yourself. But we will make sure that we capture all of these great links and everything for posting on the Roundtable website.
Thank you. We do have one more question. Doesn't have to be the last one if others have questions. This is from Nikki Beliza. Do you know of any grant programs for private owners to install living shorelines? And that's for Mr. Williams or anybody else who might be aware of grant programs for private owners to install living shorelines. I know that the Northern Virginia Regional Commission was quite successful in working with partners to do a fabulous living shoreline along, I think it's in Louisiana Park in Prince William County, but I'm not aware of any from for private owners. Anybody have any thoughts?
Penny, this is Laura Grape again. Yes, actually, the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program actually provides cost share for living shoreline practices along tidal waterways. And so working in close coordination with the Shoreline Erosion Advisory Service, as well as the Virginia Marine Resource Commission, all of the permitting that would be required is certainly part of that. But it is only for tidal areas. It is not more upstream in more of the slack water, if you will. So, it doesn't necessarily affect stream restoration either. So, but that is a nice local program, and the Soil and Water Conservation Districts administer that. And so all of the ones that are located in the Chesapeake Bay region and watershed are participating in the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program, and we appreciate the fact that there is some state funding supporting that program now. In particular, the Northern Neck Soil and Water Conservation District and Colonial Soil and Water Conservation Districts down along the Northern Neck and Middle Peninsula have been installing living shorelines pretty extensively through this program. So there's a lot of experience and great efforts. We have not had one yet in Fairfax, but the offer is on the table for all coastal residents.
Thank you. And there's some additional information in the chat from some of our members about living shoreline programs. Any other questions for Mr. Williams before we move to our next speaker? Anybody else have anything they want to add or ask? All right. Then, Mr. Williams, thank you very, very much for your presentation. And we will be in touch with you about a follow-up either later this year or perhaps early next year. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate the opportunity, and don't hesitate to reach out separately if you have any other questions or anything else comes up.
Okay, we are about 20 minutes ahead of schedule, so that's good. This is a Friday. If we were meeting in person, being ahead of schedule means we could get home earlier on a Friday afternoon. We now have, and I believe Dr. Mitchell is on the call. She was going to join a little bit late, but I thought I saw her name on the call. Is Dr. Mitchell with us?
I am here now.
Yes, you are. Good. This next presentation is a prediction of future septic system failure sites. And Dr. Molly Mitchell is a research assistant professor with the Center for Coastal Research Management at the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences. As you may know, in Virginia's Chesapeake Bay localities, septic pump outs are required every 5 years. Failing septic systems, that's a hard thing to say, septic systems, are a different public health concern, but one with very local impacts, especially for many of our Watershed Roundtable members. A place like Fairfax County doesn't have nearly as the kind of septic usage that many of our surrounding jurisdictions have. But nonetheless, it is a public health concern. Dr. Molly Mitchell, as I mentioned, is an assistant research professor at VIMS and is engaged in research and advisory efforts that help the management of natural resources in the Chesapeake Bay and elucidate the impacts of different decision-making pathways. The recent research focuses particularly on trends in sea level rise and acceleration rates around the United States and their impacts to tidal marshes, estuarine systems, and the built environment. She's been very busy, I'm sure. Those are all hot button issues for many of the people across the country that I connect with in the various opportunities I have as an elected official. So, Dr. Mitchell, we're ready to hear what you have to tell us. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen with you all. And I just wanted to start by pointing out my co-authors here, Robert Isdahl, Julie Herman, and Christine Tomlinson are from VIMS and the Center for Coastal Resource Management with me. But we also did a lot of collaboration with the Division of Data Management and Process Improvement at VDH. So it was actually their data that we were using for the analysis. Okay, so if for anyone who's like me, has always lived in an area with sewer, I just wanted to start with this map. This is the coastal area, Tidewater, Virginia, basically. The green lines are the sewer systems. So all the areas without green lines are on septic. Personally, I did not appreciate before I started this project the extent to which our coastal zone has septic fields. And so how this is going to be a really pressing issue. The problem with coastal septic systems. So there are a few things that we know about septic systems. One of them is that your traditional in-ground septic system, and this is a diagram of the traditional septic system from a nice EPA document that's a nice, easy, explanatory one. So they require unsaturated sediment. So this part, this green part, has to not be wet. And the reason for that is that they need the air in that unsaturated sediment to help break down the nutrients and bacteria and things that are coming out of the septic tank and through the drain field. So we need this buffer between the groundwater of unsaturated sediment, but then sea level is rising very quickly in Virginia. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And sea level rise leads to increasing water table levels. which leads to septic system failure. The other thing we know is that these failing septic systems result in increased loading of bacteria, viruses, nitrogen, and possibly phosphorus to adjacent waterways. So this is sea level rise in Virginia. This blue lines here are the measured mean monthly sea level. So this is the kind of variation we've seen. This is the trend through that variation. So this orange line is the trend through the variation. We've seen about 8 inches of sea level rise since the 1970s. If we look out, if that trend continues out, we see that we'll be expecting about 1.7 feet. So over 1.5 feet of sea level rise, possibly as high as 2 feet of sea level rise by 2050. So what's happening is we have a high rate of rise, and there are a number of different factors contributing to this, including ground subsidence. So the ground is sinking a little faster in Virginia than it is along the upper part of the Atlantic coast. But we also have some ocean processes that are contributing to this high rate of rise in Virginia. Currently, it's about 5.3 millimeters a year. This is the highest rate of rise on the Atlantic coast. But it's also accelerating. So every year that rate of rise is getting just a little bit higher. So what that means is that we've noticed an increase in flooding and water issues since the 1970s. But it took us a long time. So you wouldn't have noticed maybe that increase between 1970 and 1980. But now we're starting to notice these increases on a faster and faster time scale. So the area is really going to change substantially. If we have sea level, okay, it's lower here in this diagram, we want a minimum of 3 feet between the bottom of our septic drain field and the groundwater table. Okay, so that allows the septic the material in it to be cleaned of most of the pollutants, okay, before it enters the groundwater. And what goes out into our waterways is relatively clean. Sea level actually pushes groundwater tables higher too. So as sea level comes up, the groundwater on these coastal areas also comes up. Now we don't have our minimum 3 feet anymore. And the sediment, the sewage isn't treated. So it's entering the groundwater untreated and into the waterway only slightly treated, okay? Because it does get a little bit treated as it moves through the groundwater. So this does contribute to pollution. The Chesapeake Bay Watershed Model, the 2009 scenario, estimated it might contribute as much as 6% of the total nitrogen load in the Chesapeake Bay Watershed, which is not that much. But in small water bodies, you can have much higher local effects. So there was a study done in Massachusetts where they found that 74% of the nitrogen in this small bay was attributed to failing septic systems. It's very hard to figure out how much impact there is from failing septic systems by looking at the water quality, because the strength of the relationship depends on how fast these tidal creeks flush. So this is just a map showing some tidal flushing rates from the Northern Neck area. And what you can see is that even creeks right next to each other may flush at different rates. So these green ones are kind of intermediate flushing rates, and these purple ones are slow flushing rates, which means that if you get pollutants into this water body, it's going to take longer for them to clear than if they go into this water body. So you're going to have overall poorer water quality in a slow flushing creek. Failing septic systems can also cause bacterial contamination of the groundwater. And so that can have other issues, but also it can be brought into creeks and things. Our project goal, we had two kind of main points we were trying to look at. One was to assess the changes in septic failure rates with changing climate conditions, to say, okay, so where are the areas where the failures are due to high groundwater tables or changing groundwater tables, where future failures are likely to happen. And the other one was to just check to see if there was any impact of increased septic failure on current water quality conditions. So this is not looking forward, it's looking at the current conditions. To do this, we used data from the VDH's permit repair database. So these are permits for systems which have failed and have been repaired, okay? And it's a good data set of what's been happening, but there are a lot of things that you can't actually pull out of this data. So we know there are a lot of reasons that septic systems fail. One of the big ones is human. So if there's poor maintenance, the septic systems aren't being pumped out, people are parking on septic fields or growing trees on their septic fields, those can all lead to failure. There's no known proxies for this, like there's no way for us to get at this information in the data, but human predictability is really low. So if you see a pattern in something, it's likely not due to a human factor, right? So the human impacts are spread out randomly throughout the environment. If we see a pattern, we know there's something else going there. So the two things that'll cause patterns are structural, so the age of the system and the type of the system, and the particularly if you have like a neighborhood which was all built at a certain time period, they could all be aging out at the same time, leading to a hot spot of septic failures. Unfortunately, we didn't know the age of the systems, and that is because most of the records in Virginia are still kept on paper. So VDH's database that we were using only goes back to 2009. So we didn't know if a system was older than having been put in 2009. The other reason they fail is geologic. Okay, so high water tables, seasonal or permanent, so they can fail because you have like high rain or high tides in the fall, bringing up a seasonal water table, low soil permeability. And so the geologic part is the part where there's actually data that we can use to look at these issues. So the original plan was to take the data that we know, okay, so we know elevation, the hydric gradient of the soil, the septic absorption of the soil, the depth to water table, the percent sand is kind of the opposite of the clay. So we know the distribution of these different characteristics of the soil. And so the original plan was to try and build a model using this information. However, we found it did not match particularly well with the record of septic failures. So why is that? Well, a big part of it is just a scale issue. So, so the data scale didn't match very well. The other problem is that we were using proxies for things. So we know that a high groundwater table is a problem. So we were using soil hydric gradient as a proxy for that. It is not exactly the same thing as a depth to water table. And so for all these things, we were using proxies. Each one of them was not particularly good at predicting septic failures. So we took a different approach. And so what we did was we said, okay, what if instead of trying to model the underlying conditions and assuming that means that a septic system will fail, because apparently that's not a very good predictive way to look at it. What if we just said, where is it that these systems are failing on a big scale, okay? So if we look at these red dots, our repair permits, what we can do is take a geospatial statistical model that looks at this cluster of failures here and says, is that a significantly higher level of clusters, a significantly closer cluster of failures than you would expect to see? So if we compare it to all the other places on this map, do we see that many failures in such a small area? in other places or not. And this gives us what we call hotspots. And so these hotspots are identifying areas where septic failures are clustered very close together. It doesn't tell us why they're clustered very close together, but it does tell us that there is something happening there. And then we actually used a temporal component to this. So what we did was we took 9 years of data and we did this analysis for each of the 9 years. And then we stacked the 9 years of information, okay, for every grid. And this is results from the stacked information. So what it says is these are different types of hotspots. So a consecutive, these solid colored ones, or persistent, so this is the other solid colored one, hotspots say that in every year, basically, there are lots of failures here. There are more failures than you would expect in these areas every year. Whereas other ones, like these dotted ones, are sporadic hotspots. So that means in some years, there were a lot of failures in this area. And in other years, there were not a lot of clustered failures in these areas. And so this is where you might be looking more at that seasonal impact. So maybe seasonally high water tables, or in particular years, you had really high water tables and you get a lot of failures. But it could also be that there's a lot of systems aging out. So maybe a neighborhood was built and there are a lot of systems that aged out in one clump, and then a lot of systems aged out in another clump. But these are telling us now the trend through time in these geospatial patterns. So there are three kinds that we saw predominantly that do give us some useful information. So our consecutive and our persistent hotspots were about 38% of the hotspots that we found. So these are areas where there are current issues, there have been current issues since 2009. These are definitely, there's a high potential they could be impacting the adjacent water bodies because there are consistent failures in these areas. And they might be, there's definitely targets for management of some kind. You know, sewer systems, it really depends on how close you are to be able to hook in and tie in, but possibly community septics or that kind of thing. We have intensifying hotspots. These are only 3% of it, but these are our emerging issues. These are back in 2009, they were not hotspots of failure, but over time they have become more and more hotspots. So these are indicators that something's changing where we see these. So they may be places that are at high risk of failure under increased sea level rise, because that would be one thing that was certainly changing about them. Then sporadic hotspots, those are 47% of the ones we saw. And these are the ones I was saying, these are the dotted ones, likely due to years of high water table. So if we have years, if they're on the shoreline, it's a little hard to, then there's a lot of tidal influence on those high water tables. It's hard to predict exactly when that will change. But if they're in more of the upland and it's increased precipitation that's affecting them, then they are places we probably would want to monitor when there's really high, high precipitation years. Okay, one of the other things we did in that analysis was we pulled out high density failure areas. So these are grid cells where more than 25% of the houses in the grid had repair permits. This house only has 20 grids. It has, this grid only has 20 houses being shown down here. So it's not a ton of houses, but having 6 repair permits in a block of 20 houses is, you know, a little surprising. It's a high number. We didn't get very many of these, which is good. But unfortunately, they were frequently in close proximity to water. So this suggests that there might be a connection between these spots and the groundwater tables in these areas, that there's been a change in the groundwater since the septic systems were installed. Okay, so the other thing we wanted to look at was water quality and whether there was an impact on water quality from these septic failures. So we started by looking at closures where where creeks have been closed for shellfish harvesting. So this is another data set from VDH. And there's two criteria for closure. So these green dots, or these black dots, are the annual geometric mean. When they cross this dotted line, they've crossed the threshold for closure. These red ones are the 90th percentile. So when it crosses this dashed line, that is the criteria for closure. These are 4 different stations from around the Chesapeake Bay. And what we can see is that some of them basically have been constantly closed. Okay, so they're always above the criteria for closure. Other ones are almost never. So this one only had this 1 year where it would have been above the criteria for closure. But even so, there's an upward trend in the annual geometric mean. So it hasn't crossed that criteria for closure yet, but it's certainly heading in a worrying direction. And then this is another one that's very much like that. There are a couple years where the 90th percentile crossed the threshold, not every year, but again, we have this upward trajectory, which suggests that it might become, in the next few years, more permanently closed. Okay, so if we map this is, each of these is a water quality station, and it's the number of years the station's been closed due to water quality issues. So the darker color, this dark red, means it's been closed 9 years out of the 9 years that we looked at. Whereas this light yellow is that it's only been closed 1 to 2 years out of the 9 years that we looked at. And what we can see is a lot of these creeks have these kind of patterns that's connected to how well the creek flushes. And up in the top, where you don't have as much tidal exchange, you're getting poor water quality, and the water quality improves as you move down the creek to where you have this bay water coming in and flushing the area. So these are, already partially impacted creeks. The question was whether it's septic that's impacting them or not. And unfortunately, like the studies I mentioned at the beginning, it's very hard to connect the two. So this is same thing. Okay, so these are closed 8 years out of the 9, and then these are closed like 2 years out of the 9. If we put the hotspot analysis on it, what we see is, like with this creek, we have near the head of the creek, right? So here's the head of the creek. We have 2 persistent hot spots of failures, and then one area that is a sporadic hot spot of failure. Certainly, it suggests that this could be part of the issue with water quality here, and that resolving the issues in this area might help clean up the water in this creek system. But it's very hard to make that actual connection without doing some kind of tracer study to see if the pollutants in the creek are actually coming from septic. Okay, so the other thing we wanted to look at was that sea level rise impact. So the way we did this was, you remember in the beginning, I showed this diagram and I said we need a minimum of 3 feet here. So what we did was we measured basically the level of the groundwater to the surface digitally through a model, okay? And then we looked at whether it was possible for a septic system to be 3 feet, to be installed 3 feet above that current water level. Then we raised sea level in the model, so raised the groundwater, and we measured that distance again. And what that gives us is a map like this. And so these dark blue areas are areas where currently there is only 3 feet between the groundwater and the surface, okay? So there's no way you could install a septic system in the ground here and have it be 3 feet, have that 3 foot spread. The medium blue are areas which will be in that condition by 2040. And the light blue areas are the ones that will be in that condition by 2080. And these Dots are individual parcels. Okay, so these are addresses with septic fields. So what we can see is there are a few septic fields right now where we should probably be suspicious that the septic field is probably not functioning the way it's supposed to. But we can also see that there's a lot more systems which are probably functioning fine right now, but within the next 20 to 60 years are not going to be able to function. Okay, and so we took this information and overlaid the hotspots, the current failures on it, and looked at what type of hotspots are occurring in there. So the consecutive ones are the ones where we're having these like failures all the time. So that was only 30% of the hotspots were in these areas where the septic's failing. 55% of them were sporadic ones. Okay, so this is suggesting that these areas are probably going to trend towards failure. So right now they're only failing periodically. But certainly the groundwater table is so close to the surface there that there's only one direction that they can head in. Okay, and so just really quickly as a wrap up, how did we get here, right? So Miami recently released a report where they looked at what it's going to cost them to fix the septic issues caused by sea level rise, and the price tag was really, really high. So there's a lot of growing awareness about this issue and that maybe we can address it earlier rather than later. So the driving forces, of course, is we have people living in the coastal plain. We have to do something waste management wise, right? The way we've chosen to handle this for the most part in rural areas is the construction of private septic systems. This is a decentralized system, so it makes it harder to address, whereas a sewer system, you know, there's people in charge of the whole group of the sewer system, and there's money that's brought in to deal with that sewer system, and you can budget out for these things. In the rural areas, we're expecting each individual property owner essentially to manage their own system, not just pump it out, but to deal with rising sea level issues. So sea level's coming up, we have these system failures that are coming in. This can lead to bacterial contribution in the water bodies. It seems that there's some indication it could be happening already. Even if it's not, it certainly will be happening within the next 20 years. So what are the responses? I put a question mark by this because I don't think this has really been sorted out. But definitely alternative waste management systems of some kind we need to consider. So whether that's centralized or whether it's private again, but they're above ground in some way. It's definitely, I think it's the time to start thinking about what these responses could be before sea level comes up higher. Okay, so the important thing to remember about this is all of this data that VDH collects is for regulatory and permitting processes. It's not actually to see how many systems are failing or where they're located or anything like that. So we have to be careful how far we extend our conclusions from using this kind of data. But looking at the patterns of failure does allow us to target areas that we should be monitoring and areas where we really should be concentrating some adaptive actions. So that's all I have to say today. I'm happy to take questions. And also, if you have questions that come up in the next couple of days, please feel free to email me. My email is molly@vims.edu.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. A lot of what you presented, I was reflecting that we have a beach house in North Carolina that we've had for well over 40 years. We built it years ago. And 2 years ago, I had to replace the septic field. It was 40 years old. It was not inexpensive. It is right next to the water. So much of what you had presented, I thought, yep, check, check, check. From personal experience, it is not inexpensive to replace a septic field. You look at what you didn't have to pay in sewer fees, but it comes back to bite you when you have to replace your septic field. I think there was a question in the chat. I'm going to open. Actually, we have a couple of questions in the chat. Elizabeth Ward has a question. Given the human tendency to turn a blind eye to septic problems until septic backs up into the home, it is one of those unseen things, isn't it? Do you feel that testing areas of high density failures may have turned up communities where action should be taken and outreach might be helpful?
I agree. I agree with that. I do think it's a good point that that septic system failure, like complete failure, is when we actually see the impacts. But when that groundwater table is just too high to allow the nutrients to be processed and taken out, people don't see that. There's no bubbling up of the sewer to the surface. So definitely there's more that we need to know about what's happening. And I'm sorry, I suddenly got very echoey.
Thank you. We also have a comment from John Bateman. It appears we have a severe lack of data. We need to get serious about collecting data on existing systems before we can begin to address the problem. We also need to get serious about innovative alternatives. 100-year-old tech isn't cutting it. And certainly all of the detail that you gave us was for the Tidewater area. Of course, that's natural. So it may be slightly different here where we're not right on the coastline, but we also, John Bateman also indicates this problem represents a cross-section of environmental and public health. It's a comment. You can certainly respond if you wish. Maybe a little bit about the 100-year-old technology. What have you seen? In your studies, have you been able to look at the newer technology that seems to be useful, but much more expensive than the traditional septic system?
Yes, I think that's exactly the problem. So John Bateman, I know, has been very aware of this issue in the Northern Neck, the issue of data. One of the things we're not doing now is you notice looking for impacts on human health and safety, we used a data set from the Virginia Department of Health's shellfish closures. Okay, so no one's directly looking for it, like just is there septic coming into these systems? So it's kind of an indirect proxy of it. The issue with the alternative systems is that I've looked at least is that they're expensive. There's some really interesting alternative systems out there that are supposed to produce potable water essentially, but they have like UV filters and UV lights and things for treating the waste that would have to be replaced periodically. I mean, there's a lot of maintenance, it seems like, that would go into it. So I don't know. I think there's hope in that respect. I'm just not sure how it gets funded and kind of rolled out.
Thank you. Another chat question from Jerry Peters from Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District. How were failures identified that resulted in repair permits? On-site systems fail in several ways, not just backups into houses. And that's exactly ours. We saw the failure outside, not inside. So how were failures identified that resulted in repair permits? Do you have that information?
Yeah, I didn't actually, we didn't slice it that way. Basically, VDH gave us all of the failures that resulted in repairs. Okay, so these were ones that were noticed and were repaired. So, you know, I think it's a good point that sometimes you don't notice them. There may be other failures out there that we don't know about, and that the people who own the house don't know about. And then there might have been repairs that were done for not complete failures for smaller pieces of a system. So we don't know that either.
And another chat comment was that DBH was able to provide a data set of all permitted repair and installations within a predefined set of watersheds. There was a lot of potential for analysis of DBH data if there is local interest and GIS capabilities. So thank you, Dale, for that suggestion. And Norm Goulet, on similar vein, the Northern Virginia Regional Commission has collected a regional GIS inventory on septic systems, and it differs greatly for several Northern Virginia localities as compared to Chesapeake Bay program. The data set will eventually be available in our GeoData Hub later this year. So thank you, Norm. We can follow up on that with you. Excuse me. Randy Bartlett, who is the director of Fairfax County's Department of Public Works and Environmental Services. Randy, you have a question.
I do. So Molly, we've been working with USGS to monitor our streams real time. And one of the things we found was all of a sudden a large increase in nitrogen. And it was kind of downstream from an older neighborhood that was on septic. And the older neighborhood that's on septic has not had any reported septic failures. They pump every 5 years. The health department makes sure that they do that. Fairfax County has a really robust program in that regard. And my understanding of it is that the septic system itself does not remove nitrogen. The nitrogen flows into the soils below it. So that what's happening is the soils are just over 20 years or more in the whole area become saturated with nitrogen. And it's just starting to leach out into, actually, I think it's leaching into some of the deep groundwater, as well as to the higher level water that gets into the streams. But there's no septic system failures being associated with that.
So that is, so that's a good point. So when we looked at the sea level rise issue, okay, so this is where the waste is actually treated, where the pollutants are actually removed. Okay, so this is the drain field, but it's as it moves through the aerated soil, the soil that doesn't have water, that all those things are removed from it. And this is where you can have impacts as the groundwater table comes up. This is actually part of the septic system. It's not a part we pay for, and it's not a part we maintain, but it is actually part of the septic system. And so if you don't have this space here, or some soils, if everything's working perfectly, if they're perking and aerated and the right kind of soils, the nutrients should move through them, but certainly we have a lot of systems that are not in the perfect type of soils because they just don't exist on a property. So yes, I see what you're saying, that the soil particles themselves could get saturated with the sediment, and then it will be eventually released. But yeah, so if the water table just gets a little bit higher here, you wouldn't notice a failure. This is not a system that would be replaced. So this is not a system that would be caught in those repair permits. So this system would have essentially failed because this component of it is no longer functioning, but it would not have backed up. It would not have been bubbling stuff to the surface. There'd be no way for these people to know that that septic system failed. And that's where this mapping here is, this is showing you that these houses right here, there's no way that their septic system has that 3 feet of sediment anymore to treat the water. It's just, they're not that far enough above the water table. So this is telling us something different from that septic system failure, from that permit failure permit repairs database.
Right, and in our upland areas, where where we are, I actually think our groundwater is decreasing. I think it's just an issue of saturation, and if it's saturated, there's probably not, they couldn't go out and replace their drain field because the whole community is probably pretty saturated, right?
Right. So now you're talking about alternative systems is the only solution to that, like an above ground or a community system where the drain field is upland and away from the low areas where the groundwater is high.
But from a public health standpoint, outside of the nitrogen, the bacteria is not moving through because that's still getting filtered out by the soil. So it's just the nitrogen that the soils don't completely process, right?
Okay, so this is an interesting question. They can contaminate bacteria. They can contaminate groundwater with bacteria. The septic systems can. There is some belief that if it moves even 20 feet to the water, that maybe those viruses and bacteria get filtered out before they enter the waterway. I haven't actually seen any hard numbers suggesting that. So I'd say that's still an open question.
Looking at that map, I'm thinking in Fairfax County, of course, we have areas that many areas are served by our sewer infrastructure. And there are some other areas that are not, that would have to be on septic. And it's a control of growth in many ways. So when you look at for instance, the aerial that is on the screen right now, it's sort of stunning that there are so many septic systems in such a confined area. And I think there have been lawsuits about controlling growth through not allowing additional wastewater systems to be installed. So that's a political issue that we have to deal with. I'm not going to ask you to comment on it, but it does, in looking at what we do in Fairfax and some of Northern Virginia and looking at what's happening there, it's just wow. There are a couple of comments in the chat from Norm Goulet. Norm, I think if I'm reading this correctly, in a USGS, I guess, was it a survey of difficult run or an evaluation of difficult run, the mass of nitrogen available from septic system leachate could be approximately an order of magnitude greater than that from fertilizer. Impact is from density as opposed to failing. And from John Bateman, seems like we're making the case for more small-scale community systems in dense areas where public sewer is not available. Would anyone in the roundtable like to comment on any of that? And Dr. Mitchell, you too. Those were comments, not questions, but perhaps leading to some additional discussion.
Penny, this is Jim McGlone. Following on to what Randy said, one of the things I think we need to consider is soil saturation. The Department of Forestry, because of wildland fire, follows rainfall and soil saturation very closely. And we've been in a period since last May. I'm not sure about January. I haven't seen that data yet. May through December of last year, we were above our average rainfall. So we're in a period similar to what we had in 2018 up through July 8th of 2019, where we're getting a lot more rainfall, and soil saturation, which we model, has been pretty close to completely saturated since last October. I'm not sure how having that much soil saturation can affect how these septic systems work, but it seems to me that that would be a problem since we're trying to inject more water into that ground that's already full of water.
Thank you, Jim. Does anybody, Dr. Mitchell or anyone else, Randy Bartlett, maybe want to comment on that?
Yeah, so Norm's comment about difficult run, that's the same information that I was talking about. And if I remember correctly, and I have to verify, and the information's a couple years old, it was actually during low flow periods that the nitrogen concentration in the stream was so high. And the theory or the thinking is that it wasn't the rainfall that was causing the problem, and the rainfall actually diluted the nitrogen. It was the water usage by the people in the houses that kept that area wetter than most of the other areas. And then that was pushing the nitrogen through where the area had become saturated with nitrogen. And I'll ask Norm if that's how he remembers it.
Hi, Randy. It's Norm. Yeah, I think that's how it was, but there was still some questions on that, and the USGS was still going to be investigating it.
Thank you, Norm. And from Elizabeth Ward, as an old New York Department of Health study in Dutchess County, New York, found that the amount of land necessary to dissipate nitrogen levels in septic was 2 to 3 acres. And yes, I've been aware of some of that also. I think, in fact, our Occoquan area, when we down some of the Occoquan, I think that's many of them are 5 acres. Dr. Mitchell, did you want to respond to the previous conversation?
Well, I think both comments actually brought up that point that I made in the beginning about flushing rates affecting the impact of the septic. So when you have a lot of rainfall in a small catchment, you actually can get flushing really quickly. So it can move the nutrients back out into the open water, can dilute what's there, and it can move the nutrients out into the Chesapeake Bay as a whole. So that's why it's hard to generalize what the impacts are from. So we know things are changing. We know things are going to change even faster, but it's hard to generalize what those impacts will be on a particular creek or a particular water body, because there are all these other factors, particularly if it's tidal, if it's really tidal. Okay, so if it's a little bit tidal, then the rainfall and the catchment size is the big stuff. If it's in one of these really tidal areas, then the tide is pushing up and washing things out too. So there's a lot of things going on there.
Thank you. And another question in the chat is, what are your next steps with your research? How can we roundtable or the Soil and Water Conservation Districts help?
Well, that is a great question. Thank you. We're working with DEQ right now to look at where wells are, private wells are, in addition to where these septic systems are. And we're trying to find as much information as possible. Like I said, a lot of the data is captured on paper records. However, John Bateman had pointed us to, for the Northern Neck PDC, there had been an effort to do a access database that had this information taken out of paper records, or it has some of the information taken out of paper records. So if people know about any local databases that might contain more detailed information than what's captured in the state databases, that would be a fantastic help. We are currently digitizing some records for these for the DEQ well project, but digitizing the records is a slow process. So if other people have already done it, that would be amazing. Yeah.
Thank you. I know that quite often the state doesn't realize how much data localities have and have right at their fingertips, so that it doesn't even have to go through some long involved process. So maybe Randy Bartlett or someone from Fairfax County could connect with Dr. Mitchell with some of our data and some of the other jurisdictions that may have that data also, because it is true that we operate on data, and some of us have really good data and some are not aware of the good data that we have. So are there any other questions of Dr. Mitchell? This has been a fascinating discussion. Any other questions? You can either use the hand feature, the raise your hand feature, or just ask for recognition verbally. Anyone?
Penny, I hope you don't mind. I do have a question.
Definitely. Go ahead.
Molly, you cited on one of your slides percentages for persistent hotspots, intensifying hotspots, and sporadic hotspots. That total was 88%. Was there an attempt? Was there an attempt to grow that percentage a little bit? You may have had your hands tied, I don't know, but an 88% response rate seems a little bit off.
These ones? Yeah, it's actually, if you look over here, there's more than 3 types of hotspots that you can have.
Okay.
So these were just the 3 ones that we actually were the most dominant, even though this one's only 3%. They were actually the most dominant 3 types. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's a good point. Yes, there.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Any other questions of Dr. Mitchell? As we're looking at some of these aerial photos and talking about creeks flushing and so forth, I'm reminded of a tour taken, I think it was through Eelgrass, just a few years ago, to some areas in Virginia that are doing oyster beds in the creeks. And they said we said, well, what do you need the most of? The most important thing they needed was clean water, because even the smallest amount of change in the water would affect those tiny little spats in the oysters and the oyster beds. And that was a surprise. I think most of us had not thought about that. But for the small businesses that are operating those, he said we have to have the water, because of course you're right there. The beds are right there where the creeks come into the larger water body. You don't see it, but you certainly can understand it when their harvests are poor because of poor water flow. And it's not in the bay, it's just in the creeks. Again, making the point that when we take care of our local water bodies, the effect on the bay will be positive. Thank you, Dr. Mitchell, very much. This was a fascinating discussion also. Oh, I know, before I let you go, I want to ask, I'm going to put Woody Hinson on the spot here. Woody, if you could unmute yourself. Because of your long association with the Roundtable and all the things I've learned from you, because you are in a rural area and you deal with these things every day, could you, I'm sure that you've had a lot of situations that are directly affected by septic systems in your district, in your county. Would you sort of give us an on the ground idea of what you see and what you hear from your constituents? If you could unmute yourself, that'd be great.
I'm going to try and help Woody unmute himself. Woody, I just sent you a request to unmute, and hopefully that popped up on your screen.
I don't think Woody's able to hear us, maybe. Give us a thumbs up, Woody, if you're able to hear us. Okay, but we're not able to hear you. So you need to find the unmute button, the mute unmute button on your screen, and hit that with your mouse.
It should be on the bottom of your screen. You should see buttons that say mute, start video, share. We'll get you there.
You have somebody nearby who can help you? We'll give Woody a minute. I'm sorry, I put Woody on the spot, but I value his up close and personal assessments of these situations, because that's what his district is all about and what his
Can he call
everyday
in?
activity.
Can he call in with the phone?
Good question. Can you call? Do you have a cell phone that you can call us, Woody?
I think he's trying to work it out on his end, no doubt about it. I wanted to just mention, Penny, while we're waiting, is that there was a request for Dr. Mitchell's contact information, and her email address is in the chat as well. She did have to leave for another obligation, but she just mentioned that she appreciated the interesting questions and comments that were received, and she would very much appreciate to hear about any other additional information that could be used to kind of share the understanding regarding septics as well. So it may be something that everybody could reach out to their local health district to support. And certainly, as I mentioned, today's program will be posted on the website. So if it's something that you would like to share with others, I hope you'll feel free to do so.
Thank you, Laura. As we're waiting for Woody, it sounds like he's trying to call in. I'll take questions or comments from anybody else. You can just ask for recognition verbally if you'd like to. Anybody have any comments or suggestions for future programs? We're a little bit ahead of schedule from our regular adjournment, but happy to take any of that. Okay, Woody, it looks like maybe we're not going to have a success. So I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but we will connect with you the next time and give you an opportunity to share your expertise with us. So thank you very much for trying, Woody. I'm sorry it didn't work. I'm going to go for updates from around the region right now, so that if anybody who wants to give us an update from what they're doing, I see, Jim McClone has already given us something about soil saturation, but he's with the Department of Forestry in Virginia, and so I also see it. I see Kirsten Conrad also. So
you think I'm on? Hello, Penny.
Oh, do we have Woody?
Yeah.
Oh, excellent. Would you please give us your from your perspective what you heard for just for a couple of minutes? Thank you.
Yes, I would love to. Thank you so much. Sorry, I was having technical difficulties. I'm old, I'm slow. What I want to talk about, both of your speakers have been excellent, but I'm glad you asked for me because I'm a farmer and I travel the fields and the land. And my farm is on the Rappahannock River. I have Peavy Creek behind my farm. My home is on Maddox Creek, which is off the Potomac River. So I'm on the water all the time. I want you to know that farmers spent more money having wreckers come pull their combines out of holes from being stuck this fall. We have had the highest groundwater we've had in my lifetime, and I'm 71. Some crops, I know I have one neighbor that actually parked his combine in the shed and said, I'm not going to try to pick corn anymore because I can't afford to wrecker 3 times a day. And he came back and picked the corn last Sunday or Sunday before last, and he should have done it in September. So I want you to I was listening very close to the septic story. Our groundwater is the highest it's ever been. If you spin a wheel in a field and sink as much as a foot, you hit water in the northern neck now. Keep in mind, with this much rain, our tides are running swifter and higher than normal in creeks and rivers. So I'm sure that I would expect calculations of runoff and nutrients to be higher than they ever have been in my life, because I don't think septic systems can possibly be working with as much water as we have and the saturation of water we have. And then the more rainwater you have, the more flow you have of your creek and rivers towards the bay. So we do have a real problem. And where farmers usually are complaining about how dry it is, I have to complain this year has been the wettest year in my life. And so I expect to see problems from it. I want to compliment you on bringing up one other thing that I've learned from the fishermen and the duck hunters and the oystermen over a lifetime of being on the water, is eelgrass at the beginning of your program. Without eelgrass, we do not have a place for crabs and oysters and fish that lay eggs and create habitat for a good nursery. I would call eelgrass a nursery for waterfowl. I think you've hit two of the best points we should hit today. Keep in mind, a lot of problems have to be addressed long term. And where the West Coast had fires all year, we had water all year. And I think that made us have an unusual problem that we may not have again. But I have to admit, we have it right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Woody. I am so glad that we got your technical difficulties fixed, because it's really important to hear from you. And I always learn something from you. So thank you very, very much. I think we had a comment or a question or an update from Kirsten Conrad. Kirsten, can I see your hand up?
Yes, I have just a lovely piece of news to share with you. And it is that the Master Naturalist, the Arlington Regional Master Naturalist chapter, were recently honored by the Wildlife Society the Virginia chapter of the Wildlife Society for their work on educating the public about the need for white-tailed deer management. This is a huge problem with overpopulation in our area, and I believe that the overpopulation does have ramifications for water quality as well as biological resource conservation. But they've been doing a bang-up job. And of course, the joke is that every jurisdiction around us, Fairfax County, Montgomery County, even the National Park Service has got some kind of white-tailed deer management program in place. And so the joke is that they all come to Arlington to escape that control, but which usually takes the form of lethal, control measures. At any rate, I wanted to let you know that this important conservation work is going on, and congratulations to the Master Naturalist program.
Thank you, Kirsten. Jim McClone has an announcement. Jim?
Yeah, I just wanted to let everybody know that the Virginia Trees for Clean Water Grant program is open. We're accepting applications through February 16th. This is a cost share program for planting trees, both on public, common interest, and private property. And if you're interested, contact your local forester, DOF forester. They can help you with that. I also, with regard to the WIP 3, Department of Forestry, there are a couple of items in the government's budget. We are, in the budget anyway, is funding for 4 watershed forester positions, 1 at headquarters and 3 in each of the regions, to help with meeting the tree planting goals under WIP 3 that we talked about several meetings ago. And just to amplify what Kristen said, deer are a big issue for water quality because they're eating one of our primary water quality technologies, which is trees.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Nikki Beleza from Fairfax Water in the chat says that Fairfax Water is offering water supply stakeholder outreach program grants to support citizen source water protection efforts and community activities related to water supply. Applications must be mailed or postmarked by May 17th, so you've got plenty of time. Projects or programs must be within Fairfax Water's source waters or service area to be eligible. And more information is available at www.fairfaxwater.org/grants, and that is in the chat. Any other comments or updates from any of our members? Don't be shy.
I'd like to add just
Daniel Moore. Go ahead, Daniel.
Brief comment relative to tree planting. You may not be aware, but I saw on Huffington Post this morning, there's a very interesting article on tree planting, and with the cautionary note that oftentimes tree planting programs fail because the emphasis is on digging a hole and sticking a tree in and then walking away from that process. I think it might be interesting reading for all of us. It references, it's kind of on an international scale, but there's an argument to be made for when we develop these tree planting programs that we really need to be in it for the long haul, and there has to be proper maintenance and care for the trees as they grow. The article notes that there are an awful lot of instances where a program to install X number of trees, that program fails because of a lack of follow through, lack of maintenance up front, if you will. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you. And I thought I saw Jim McClone's hand up. Certainly, just like anything else, I mean, we Americans, we build a road and then we figure it's going to last forever. We plant a tree.
Right. I was just giving a thumbs up, Penny. I was just giving a thumbs up to the fact that we do have to think about maintenance, and to the extent that we're doing tree planting with to address social justice issues, maintenance is one of the big pushbacks that we get from people in communities where they don't want to have to take care of that tree that you want to plant for free in their front yard because it's supposed to be so good for them and to address those environmental justice issues. But yes, tree planting is something that the tree people, or tree maintenance has been something tree planting or tree people have been talking about for a long time.
Thank you, Jim. And that occurs to me that the Climate, Energy, and Environmental Policy Committee at Metropolitan Council of Governments, it's CEPC, is the short term. We just had a report last week from our tree canopy subcommittee, which we put together 2 years ago at COG, and that subcommittee has come up with a tree planting cookbook. It is in draft form right now. They presented it to the committee. We made some suggestions for making it a little bit more user-friendly, but hopefully by the next time we meet, that tree planting cookbook may be available to all jurisdictions. Any other comments or updates from anybody? Laura, do you have any last words for us?
Well, first of all, thanks to everybody for their participation today. I wanted to just make one more note. I included in the chat feature a link to Fairfax County's Tree Basics booklet, which was developed by the Fairfax County Urban Forestry Management Division and the Fairfax County Tree Commission. It's a really great guide on how to plant and care for your portion of the urban forest or your portion of your local forest as well. And I think it's fascinating. I wanted to just share that the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District holds an annual native seedling sale. And we have definitely seen an uptick in interest over the last several years. And we have been completely overwhelmed by the demand that we saw this year. We sold out of all of our seedling packages within a day, within half a day, actually. It was just absolutely remarkable. So I think we have all sorts of different theories as to why that might have happened. I think the interest and the collaborative and collective efforts from all sorts of different groups in terms of promoting the value and the benefits of native plants has certainly increased the level of awareness. And we've definitely seen a tremendous paradigm shift in terms of folks wanting to incorporate them into their landscapes. And so I just share that with you as I would imagine that many of you, the members of your communities as well, are also on the prowl for native plants. And so there's some great programs going on across the Commonwealth in terms of looking regionally at native plants, and some great groups developing materials to help support that and make them a little bit more visible at the retail establishments as well. So I just share that as information you may want to put on your own sale as well, and help to get some of these plants into the hands of your residents in a very cost-effective manner. But anyway, that's all I have to share today. I just, again, always, it's so nice to see everybody, even to just know that you're here and you're present. It's nice to be back in the swing of things, and we look forward to seeing you again in April.
Thank you, Laura. I think that as people have had to stay home over the last almost year, they're looking at their own surroundings now. They have time to look at it. We hear about people wanting to remodel their homes to allow home offices. They're looking at cleaning out stuff that's accumulated for a long time because they can now. I think part of that stay-at-home COVID is also people are expanding their horizons to the environment and to what's around them, which was sort of in a rush before because they were going all the time, and now they're stuck. And so we can't let any emergency or catastrophe go to waste. And so this is the focus on the environment as positive. Hopefully that will continue even when we are no longer under restrictions. The next meeting for the roundtable is scheduled for April 9th. We will have to do it virtually. Hopefully by the time we get later in the year, we'll be able to do it in person again. But today, on April 9th, we will be virtual. I want to thank Laura and her staff for making this work pretty seamlessly, and wish you all a good weekend and health, and to wear your masks, social distance, do all the things we're supposed to do so we can get through this together. Thank you so much, and bye-bye. We're adjourned.
Thank you.
Okay.